blocked President Obama from putting through Merrick Garland's nomination before the last presidential election.
I think that there's been a lot of discussion around whether or not we should move forward with this confirmation hearing, given the investigations that have been going on with the administration. But I think that there's a precedent for having done so. Bill Clinton was under investigation for years and elected and nominated many federal judges during his 6 years of investigation that all went through and were confirmed. So I think that we have a historical precedent of acting in that way.
Okay, and there some speculation about President Trump picking Kavanaugh because he had written an opinion saying that presidents should not be under the threat of criminal prosecution while they're in office. Do you think that played a part?
I mean, it seemed like that angle was a little exaggerated to me. I'm not sure that's exactly what he said. And it's not entirely clear to me why President Trump picked it. We do know that he was in that list of 25 that he had composed at some point. I would say on the sort of the legislative squeamishness, the Democrats are going to try to make a process argument that they didn't get there.
Or is it more about politics, Rachel Tripp?
I think that this is largely about politics, at least when it comes to President Trump's latest threat of the latest round of tariffs that will add billions, hundreds of billions of dollars to tariffs that have already been imposed. But I think he's playing a pretty dangerous game. I think he is playing what he believes to be a political game in terms of trying to change the Chinese markets and having them allow different restrictions or different regulations to be lifted from American businesses. But in doing so, he is actually harming not only our domestic markets, but also the global markets as well. China can't retaliate in the way that they have done by matching these tariffs because they're so high and because the import-export between our two countries is so skewed, but they can retaliate in other ways that could be pretty drastic.
So Zed Jelani, what chance are there that this political move, as Rachel suggests, might backfire economically?
Well, it's really interesting. Trade wars are not totally abnormal in U.S. history. I remember Bush had a dispute with the European Union, and the European Union responded by threatening to place tariffs on states like Florida, like on Florida's produce. So that's
with China targeting specifically at that kind of market. Will that concern Republicans generally?
I think we will see an immediate harm to the American consumer, but first we will see a harm to the American farmer, to the American exporter, the companies who are manufacturing these goods that previously were being shipped to China at what is now a very different rate. If these tariffs were to be approved, and I think that it shows Congress's potential concern around these new tariffs, that they have requested a policy where they do have to approve new tariffs at this point. I think that if they do that, then the Chinese have a very real ability to intentionally hold up American companies and imports in a way that will no longer allow them to be profitable. Cherries is another great example of this. We have already seen cherry manufacturers who are sending cherries to Asia, specifically to China, and they're being held up for what is now new regulatory inspections just long enough for them to spoil, right? So that is a great example of completely lost money, lost resources, all going away from the pocket of the United States.
And Zed Jelani, how do you think we got to this point where you have a president who's really going against what his party believes in trade when it comes to free trade versus tariffs?
Well, I think part of it is that President Trump doesn't have a whole lot of ideological conviction. He had the reverse opinion on a number of issues 5 or 10 years ago. But I think this is something where he consistently, over a set of decades, had criticized a number of the FTAs. He had criticized China's role in trade. And he appointed someone who's actually fairly ideological. It was that professor out in California, Pierre Navarro, to run a lot of his trade policy. And his USTR rep, by the way, I think also is in favor of some changes, a long time in favor of some changes to trade. So I think this is an issue where he really has actually deep conviction. I mean, you might not say he has very deep conviction on like religion. When he tries to talk about the Bible, sometimes it's a little bit odd. He's trying to adjust himself to being a Republican. But I think here, he actually really believes this. And, maybe it's more his belief than politics in this case.
Okay. Out that Jeff Deal, who is the endorsed Republican Senate candidate for Senate in Massachusetts, he's running against Elizabeth Warren. He is actually leading Elizabeth Warren in the polling over independents, which has huge significance for such a blue state and one that has historically had a very hard time electing Republican officials.
Okay, so we'll see how Elizabeth Warren gets on.